Alright, so Iansan is basically here. She is an amazing character that every one of us would absolutely love to have on her account. Now in today's video, we're going to be looking into a comparison between Bennett, Iansan, and Kujo Sarah. Now I know that I did not include Sarah in the title or in the thumbnail of the video. However, what she does is that she does also has a bit of attack buffing toward your characters, which is why we're going to be including her in the comparison as well, so that overall we have kind of like an in-depth comparison between the character, which can be quite important for those of you out there as well, because you can be considering Iansan, but you don't know whether or not she's going to be too much of a game changer on your account that she's really much a must-have for you guys to pull, so that you can decide whether or not it's worth it for you guys to put down your Primo Gems or just go ahead and save for either Mavuika, Shalona, or Sitlali that's going to be coming back pretty soon. Now, before we start throwing comparisons around, let's take a kind of a quick breakdown of what each character actually does. Right, so Bennett, the most important part of his kit is going to be his elemental burst that creates a field and heals your allies, as well as boosts your on-field character attack based on his base attack. Kujo Sarah has an elemental skill will grant you an attack buff based on her base attack, but it requires you to have a charge shot to activate it. Her elemental burst also provides the same attack buff while dealing AoE electro damage. Obviously, we're going to be touching a lot more on Constellation in a bit because these character constellations are very important, but right now we're just going through the base kit for the time being. For Iansan, she has a unique mechanic Night Soul system where it buffs strengths depending on her Night Soul point and it gained by your character moving around. Whenever she have high Night Soul point, which is above 42, you're going to be having a stronger attack buff, while if she is having less of a 42 Night Soul point, you're going to be having a weaker buff. The more important part of her kit surrounds her elemental burst, right? At first, she deals a massive AoE electro damage and summons a kinetic energy skill that follows your active character. As I've mentioned before, these skills will allow you to have high attack buffing depending on her Night Soul point, but the catch is that you do have to have your character move around constantly so that you can have a high attack buffing. Other than that, if you're out of combat for over a second, the buff will automatically disappear. So why are we even comparing Bennett, Sarah, and Iansan in the first place? While all three of them are attack buffer, however, they achieve it in completely different ways, which is the whole point of the video, so that you can have a clear difference between these characters. Now, what are the key similarity and differences between these two characters? First off, it's going to be the buffing method. So basically, all three characters scales their buff based on their base attack rather than their personal stats. But the main difference is that Bennett is still technically the easiest to use. You just have to stand inside his burst circle in order for you to get buffed. For Sarah, if you have at the C0, you do need to have a precise timing and aiming your shot to deliver her buff effectively. Other than that, you will have to rely on her elemental burst. However, if you do have her C2, that's a lot easier. You now just have to cast your elemental skill, and then you will have a direct buff from Sarah. However, as we can see, her buff is pretty short, which is only 6 seconds. Quite hard to work around effectively whenever you're playing around with her. But obviously, when you're having Sarah, you really do have to optimize your rotation, and I'm pretty sure you guys are already used to it if you're using Sarah for a long time. For Iansan, yeah, technically speaking, she is easier than Bennett because the kinetic skill actually follows around your active character, but your character again have to kind of move constantly in order for you to get the maximum buffing from Iansan. So for that, Iansan is more easy whenever she's working on the right DPS teams. When it comes to energy and burst cost, this is rather important as well, because there are supportive characters on your account that depends on their elemental burst a lot. Therefore, the faster they get their burst, the easier for you to make your rotation. Now technically, we can see Bennett is the most energy efficient, not only with his elemental burst cost only 60, but he does regenerate pretty nice particle from his elemental skill. Iansan is decent. Technically speaking, you can give her kind of like a Favonius Lance and she's very much good to go. Other than that, if you're using a high attack base polearm, then you will have to look into covering her energy regen a bit. Whereas for Sarah, she will struggle without having sufficient energy regen, technically needing around 200% energy plus, but that is slightly mitigated because many of the time Kujo Sarah is used on an electro resonance team. For the specific role in the team, where it's more of we're looking into which kind of specific team that these characters works more in, as we know, the reason why Bennett has always been really good is he's more or less a plug and play character. Now obviously there are certain teams that do not need Bennett whatsoever, because either you're scaling with HP, right, you don't need Bennett, or if you're running in an aggravate or more or less a dendro reaction teams, then Bennett is never going to be a need. But overall, Bennett is a character that is used on pretty much most of the team comps that we have. Iansan bring more mobility and flexibility into your team building, while she is also an electro character, which makes her team comp usage a bit different in terms of Bennett at times. And then yeah, definitely the last is going to be Sarah, because most of the time she is on an electro focused team, and especially after Sarah is at a C6 level where she buff a ton of crit damage toward your electro damage. Therefore, she's more or less work slightly in a similar role toward a Chevrus as a character, where a team is much more focused there. When it comes to buffing raw attack power, all three characters would be able to bring something strong to the table. Now, Bennett provides the most consistent and reliable attack buff, always the same amount regardless of the movement uptime. Iansan has the highest potential attack boost, surpassing even Bennett if it's fully optimized. However, of course, her buff can fluctuate depending on which character you're using and also her Night Soul point levels, while Sarah can give a comparable attack buff at a C6 level, but most of the time again it is electro exclusive and will require you strict timing with your rotations. Now, buff strength is one thing, but what about how easy it is for you to play this character? For Bennett, it has always been absolutely easy. It's almost completely brainless. You just press his elemental burst, you cast his circle, and you get the instant buff. However, the only thing that you need to think about is to properly position his circle, because if your positioning isn't good and you have your enemies move around too much, then that has always been the downside of Bennett. Moreover, if Bennett is at a C6 level, you do have to be mindful of that, because if he is at C6, he does has the ability to power infuse your on-field character if they are either sword, claymore, or polearm, and also buff a bit of your character power damage. However, if your character is susceptible to the power infusion and you're not using it, it can be a pretty annoying thing when you're using a C6 Bennett. Nowadays, it's much less of a thing, and C6 Bennett is a really good thing most of the time now, so you don't really have to worry too much. Whereas Iansan is kind of somewhere in the middle, right? You don't need to precise your damage a lot because her burst buff follows you around, but you do have to move around frequently in order to maintain her strength. Cujo Sarah is rather the hardest, because if you are at the pre-C2 Cujo Sarah, you need to do a charge attack in order to activate her buff. But C2 fixes this, so technically speaking, if you want to use Sarah efficiently, you kind of need to have her C2. When it comes to team synergies, or basically best team for these character, Bennett fits on most of the DPS team apart from those who doesn't scale with attack mostly. So as always, he has always been very much easy to use. Iansan, again, it is more to a mobile DPS character who scale with attack, right? For example, Veresa, character like Cloran, Alekino, Bavuika, other Natlin character, and so on. Those characters will be able to use Iansan pretty well. While Cujo Sarah, again, it is mostly for electro DPS character like Raiden Shogun, Sino Kuching, Fish, or sometimes Yai Miko. Currently at this point, we're still testing out Iansan quite a lot, so maybe in the future we'll be able to find out more of a character that Iansan will be able to work with really well. Now, so far we've only been looking at these characters mostly at a C0 level, but what happened when you start unlocking constellations? Because when looking at it, some of these characters are quite constellation dependent. Now, Bennett, he is technically constellation dependent, especially if you don't have him at the C1, which is kind of nice. You only need one copy of him, so if you're having your Bennett without a C1, do make it a priority to get another copy of him. Cujo Sarah, as we've mentioned before, we kind of need her C2 so that it's easier for us to use. C6 Sarah is definitely going to be a huge boost because of that 60% electro crit damage. For Iansan, it's kind of fine if you have her at C0. She kind of explodes in her power at a C2, so when you're using an Iansan, you're technically looking to have a C2 at a requirement, because at that point she is kind of closer to what your Bennett buffing power. However, once she hit her C6, that's make her a pretty OP character, for she adds an extra 25% bonus damage if her Night Soul overflows, and on top of that, her buff duration get an extra 3 seconds as well, which is a really nice thing. Therefore, overall, whenever we're looking into an Iansan investment, we are kind of want to aim toward a C6 level, which technically speaking, not many of us will be able to do at the current point, but it is something for us to aim toward if you are really liking Iansan, making it a question of whether or not these characters will be still meta over time. And as we know, Bennett is basically going to be a very good character until the end of the game. We already know that, so we don't really have to think too much about it. Kyocera is kind of fine, especially if you're looking into an electro DPS meta teams, though she is strong at C6, but it's more or less team restricted. Now Iansan, we don't know just yet. There may be potential meta shift in the future that move away from her, but overall, from the look of it, as long as she's used on a DPS team that move around a lot, Iansan would technically be fine. Now that's when we're talking about Constellation investment, right? But for those of you who can't actually invest too much into Constellation for these characters, Bennett Artifacts build has always been noblesse oblige, right? At the current point, you can pretty much get it from the strong box. Free-to-play weapon, you have access to the like of Sapwood Blade, or prototype Rancor if you're absolutely free-to-play. Sometimes if you've been playing Genshin for quite a while, you should be able to have a Favonius sword, and technically that should be enough. Iansan, of course, is going to be the Cinder City set. If you already have a Cinder City set user on your team with Iansan, then she can be switched to a noblesse oblige set. Her weapon is also rather free-to-play, right? The Favonius Lance, the Ohanashi, right? The event weapon that we've just got. Those are pretty decent weapons for her, so overall they're still pretty much free-to-play friendly build. And for Kyocera is going to be the Emblem Fate artifact sets. Sarah's best weapon would be recommended to be either Favonius or Sack Bow as well, because as we know, she is energy hungry. Though if you're newer into the game, you might not be able to get these weapons as they are gacha locked. And so we've gone through pretty much every major aspect of these three characters. Now let's kind of wrap things up with a detailed summary with their strengths and weaknesses. For basically, many of the time, you want to pick Bennett if you want the easiest, strongest, and most reliable attack buffer in the game, where he can also reliably heal your team, and you don't mind having C6 power infusion issues with your DPS character. For Iansan, you prefer a mobile playstyle for your DPS character and dislike standing still within Bennett circle, while you also want a flexible attack buffer with scaling potential. And then of course, Kyocera at this point is more or less going to be a niche situation with electro DPS character. You're willing to invest more into her Constellation to make the most use of her, and you don't mind too much of a short buff duration whenever you're using her in the team. So overall, as we can see, these characters are pretty good, especially when we're looking into Bennett and Iansan, right? They're pretty much kind of like the two sides of the same coin, where Bennett is more preferred towards character that stands still a lot, and if you don't have your enemies move around too much, while Iansan prefers enemies that would probably move around a lot, and the DPS character you're using is also moving, which is kind of a nice design for Iansan from Hoyover's side, because if she do so much similar thing to Bennett, even though it's not too bad of a thing, but it doesn't feel like too much of a new character at that point. But overall, I'm still leaning toward Bennett when it comes to lower investment and usability of him, because most of us should already have a C1 Bennett at this point. Iansan, though she is technically pretty good and can be an amazing character, especially when you are investing into a Constellation. And that's also a downside, because you do need to invest into her, and you will need to use your Primogems to at least pull on this specific banner, and that's going to be a good thing depending on whether or not you like either Varesa or Xianyun at this point. Otherwise, it would be much better for you to actually just go ahead and save for either Mavuika, Sitlali, or Shilonen, who is going to be coming back pretty soon. So those, I would say, are some comparison between these characters. I hope that it has been able to help you out somehow. If you found the video enjoyable, guys, don't forget to subscribe to my channel to not miss out on my future Genshin Impact videos. I really appreciate you guys staying with me to this part of the video, guys, and with that, I wish you a super day, and I'll catch you on my next video.